You can't afford to leave, so you'll listen to me. My dad said that to me in the kitchen on a Thursday night while I was standing there holding a grocery bag and trying to decide whether I still had the energy to argue. That sentence didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't one bad night, one bad mood, or one random fight that got out of hand. It was the end result of something that had been building for months, maybe longer, in a house where temporary had quietly turned into useful, and then useful had turned into trapped. When I first moved back in with my parents, I told myself it was the smart thing to do. That was how I sold it to myself. Rent had gone up twice in less than a year, my lease was ending, and I had just come out of a relationship that had drained more money out of me than I wanted to admit. It was not some dramatic, toxic, she stole my card situation. It was the normal death by 1,000 small costs that happens when two people build a life together badly and then have to unbuild it even worse. By the time I was looking at apartments again, everything felt ridiculous. Smaller places cost more than my last place had. Anything decent disappeared fast. Anything affordable looked like it came with either mold, a 2-hour commute, or a landlord who would absolutely keep your deposit because a curtain rod looked at him wrong. My mom was the first one to say it out loud. "Why don't you just stay here for a bit?" she asked. "Save money. Reset. Get ahead instead of throwing everything away on rent." At the time, it sounded reasonable. I was 32, not 19, and that was part of why it felt practical instead of humiliating. I wasn't moving home because I had no job and no direction. I had a job, a decent one, operations support for a distribution company. The kind of work that is always busy, always slightly stressful, and never glamorous enough for anyone to ask about it twice at parties. I made enough to survive, but enough to survive and enough to build something better are two different things, especially when housing decides to start acting like a private joke you weren't invited to. So I said yes. Not forever. Not as some big life shift. Just for a while. 6 months. Maybe a little more if it made sense. Save aggressively. Let the market cool down if it was going to cool down, then get back out. That was the plan I walked in with. My dad never said much when I moved back in. He didn't welcome me warmly, but he didn't object either. He just stood in the hallway while I carried boxes in and gave one of those half shrugs that men like him use when they want credit for being accommodating without ever having to sound openly supportive. "Just don't get too comfortable," he said. I laughed when he said it, not because it was funny, but because I thought it was just his version of humor, the same dry, vaguely hostile tone he had used for most of my life whenever anything emotional got too close to the surface. I missed one of the biggest warning signs right there. I kept reading warning signs as personality quirks. The first month was manageable. Awkward, obviously, because there's no version of being back under your parents' roof in your 30s that feels fully normal, but still manageable. I kept mostly to myself, worked, saved money, and stayed out of the way. I bought my own food when I could. My mom cooked often enough that things blurred, but I tried to contribute where I could without making it into some weird symbolic thing. The first money conversation came quickly. Not on day one, and not in some ugly way. My mom brought it up while wiping down the counter one evening like she was discussing weather. "We were thinking it would make sense for you to contribute while you're here," she said. Nothing crazy, just something fair. I said that made sense, because it did. I wasn't expecting a free ride. I wasn't a teenager drifting in and out of work. I asked how much they had in mind, and the number she gave me was reasonable. It was $650 a month, lower than rent, lower than my last place, and low enough that I still felt like I was coming out ahead by being there. So I agreed. That part wasn't the problem. The problem was how fast fare started drifting. At first, it was just the monthly contribution we had agreed on. Then small things started showing up around it. My mom would mention that the electric bill had jumped by $40. My dad would complain that groceries were getting ridiculous. Somebody would casually say the $94 internet payment had landed at a bad time that month. None of it came as a direct ask at first. In that house, my mother suggested, my father implied, and then both of them waited to see whether I would fill the silence. Most of the time, I did. It was not because I was weak. It was because every individual request seemed small enough to say yes to without turning it into a scene. The electric bill one month. A grocery run the next. Gas money when my dad had to drive somewhere. A plumbing issue that was only a couple hundred, and supposedly easier if I covered it now, and they figured the rest out later. Nothing looked insane in isolation. That is how the trap stays respectable. The part that should have bothered me earlier was not the money itself. It was how quickly the money stopped being treated like help. It just became part of the weather. If I covered something, it disappeared into the background immediately. If I hesitated, even slightly, the tone changed. Not dramatically, just enough. My dad had a whole way of speaking that made normal things sound like character tests. Part of living in a house is understanding shared responsibility. If we all eat here, we all contribute. You're not a guest. That last one came up a lot, and the twisted thing about it was that it was always used in one direction. I was not a guest when something needed to be paid. I was absolutely a guest when it came to rules, tone, space, or authority. That contradiction defined him better than anything else. He liked the financial part of me being an adult. He did not like the rest of it. If I came home late, he noticed. If I went out 2 weekends in a row, he made comments. If I bought something for myself, he somehow connected it to priorities. It wasn't screaming and it wasn't chaos. He was too controlled for that most of the time. It was something colder. A constant drip of small reminders that, in his mind, living there meant I could contribute as an adult but still be positioned like a child. One night, maybe 3 months in, I came home around 11 after dinner with friends from work. He was sitting in the living room with the TV on low, not really watching it. "You're out a lot for someone trying to save money," he said. I stopped in the doorway and looked at him. It was dinner. That cost money too. It was such a stupid comment that I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was so transparent. He wanted me to hear the real message underneath it, which was that my money, while technically mine, had started to feel conceptually available to the house. That is the thing I keep coming back to when I think about that year. Not that my parents were struggling a little. They were. Not that I was helping. I was. It was the way helping started to blur into expectation, and expectation started to blur into ownership. The housing market getting worse only accelerated all of it. You couldn't go anywhere without hearing some version of the same conversation. Rates were up. Rents were still high. Buying was hard. Moving was expensive. Every article, every conversation, every half-panicked text from friends' apartment hunting had the same exhausted tone, like everyone was being slowly squeezed by numbers that no longer had any relationship to ordinary life. My dad watched all of that with the kind of interest I didn't fully understand at first. He started bringing it up more, not just in general. Around me. "You see what people are paying out there now. Your cousin's place is smaller than this and costs almost double. People think they're independent until the market teaches them otherwise." The first few times, I ignored it. It sounded like one of his usual bitter little observations about the world. But after a while, I noticed the pattern. He only really got animated about housing costs when he could angle the conversation toward me still being there. He wasn't worried for me. He was reassured by the numbers. I missed that for too long. I thought the worsening market made my situation more stressful. To him, it made his position stronger. Every increase in rent, every bad mortgage headline, every story about somebody staying home longer than planned was proof that the outside world was getting harder and his house was getting more valuable. It made his position stronger in his own head, not on paper. He liked knowing I had fewer easy exits. By the time I had been there almost a year, the atmosphere had changed in a way that would probably sound invisible to anyone who hasn't lived through that kind of thing. I was paying my contribution every month. I was covering more groceries than I used to. I had picked up a few bills more consistently than intended. I was still saving, but not as fast as I had imagined, because real life has a way of eating the clean, disciplined version of a plan. Car repair here. Work trip expense there. My own insurance, my own phone, my own life, still running underneath the family house machine I was now partially funding. And somehow, the more I contributed, the less neutral the house felt. My mother got gentler when money came up. My father got sharper. That is the dynamic in a lot of families like this. One person softens the ask. The other hardens the atmosphere. The result is the same either way. One Saturday morning I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard my parents talking in the next room. They were not fighting. They were doing that quiet, tense married whisper people use when bills are involved and they don't want anyone else to hear. Except they never whisper quite enough. My mom said, "He's already doing more than we planned." My dad said, "More than we planned isn't the same as enough." That line stayed with me all day. It did not shock me. It clarified the way he was already looking at the whole arrangement. Because it clarified something. I had been thinking about my help in terms of what had been agreed. He had already moved past that. In his head, the number was no longer tied to fairness. It was tied to capacity. If I could do more, then more was what mattered. That is how people turn your effort into a floor instead of a gift. That evening, my mom asked, very casually, if I could start handling one of the utility payments directly to simplify things. I said yes. And even while I said it, I knew something in the arrangement had shifted again. The house no longer felt like a temporary stop where I was rebuilding my footing. It felt like a place that had begun adjusting itself around the idea that I might stay long enough to become structurally useful. And the worst part was that my dad had started treating that possibility not like something to be grateful for, but like leverage. I did not have the full sentence for it yet, but by then the logic behind it was already there, living in the walls. The market was bad. Moving out was harder. I was still there. And my dad had started to understand exactly what that meant. The first time my dad really used the market against me, he did it with a smile. Not a big one. Not anything obvious. Just that faint little expression he got when he thought he was being clever without being cruel enough for anyone else to call it cruel. It happened over dinner. My mom had made chicken, my dad had the news on in the next room, and one of those housing stories was running again. Rates, affordability, supply, all the same words people had been recycling for months while pretending the situation was temporary and not just the new shape of life. My dad looked toward the TV, then over at me. "You still planning to move out soon?" he asked. The way he said soon irritated me more than it should have. It bothered me not because it was aggressive, but because it sounded amused. "Eventually," I said. He nodded once, cut into his food, and said, "You might want to redefine eventually." My mom gave him a look, but not the kind that stops anything. The kind that says, "Please do not make this uglier than it has to be." I kept eating. He waited a few seconds, then kept going. "I'm just being realistic. A lot of people are finding out they can't afford the life they thought they could." There was nothing technically wrong with the sentence. That was his real strength. He knew how to build cruelty out of plausible words. "I'm aware," I said. "I just hope you are actually doing the math," he replied. "Not the fantasy version." My mom jumped in then, fast enough to make it obvious she had felt the shift too. "He is doing fine," she said. My dad shrugged. "I'm sure he thinks so." That was the first time I realized how much he enjoyed the topic. Not housing in general. Not economics. My position inside it. Not housing in general. Not economics. My position inside it. The harder things got outside that house, the more solid he seemed to feel inside it. Over the next few weeks, he kept doing it. Every time there was some story about rent going up, or somebody getting priced out, or mortgages staying higher than people expected, he found a way to angle the conversation toward me. Not by saying, "You should stay here." That would have been too clear. Instead, he said things like, "People underestimate how expensive independence is. Everyone wants their own place until they see the numbers. Nothing wrong with staying where it makes sense." At first, I let it slide, because I told myself he was just being himself, which was the excuse I had used for him for most of my life. Then I started noticing what happened whenever I pushed back, even a little. If I said I was still looking, he asked where. If I mentioned a place I liked, he asked what it cost. If I said I could make it work, he looked at me like I was a child insisting he could drive a car by reaching the pedals with his toes. It was not concern. It was positioning. He was always trying to position himself one step above me and one step closer to my options than I wanted him to be. He was always positioning. One Sunday afternoon, I was at the kitchen table with my laptop open, looking at rental listings and half-hating all of them. My mom was folding laundry nearby. My dad came in, saw the screen, and stopped long enough to look over my shoulder. "That place is too small." I did not look up. I didn't ask. He ignored that. "And too expensive. I'm comparing options." He let out a short breath through his nose. Comparing options is what people do when they can't afford to make a decision. That one landed harder than I wanted it to, not because it was brilliant, but because it was designed to. My mom said his name in that warning tone again. He waved her off. "What?" I'm not insulting him. I'm telling him not to be stupid. I closed the laptop. I can do the math myself. He leaned one hand on the back of a chair and gave me that same look, the one that somehow combined doubt and irritation and ownership all at once. "Can you?" he asked. There was a pause after that. It was short, but it was long enough. And in that pause, I understood something I had not fully admitted to myself yet. He did not want me to fail at moving out. He wanted me to keep almost succeeding. That way the possibility stayed alive just enough to be discussed, measured, doubted, and held over me. A clean failure would have been easier to process. A clean success would have ended the game. What he liked was the middle, the stuck part. The months kept passing. My contribution to the house stayed the same on paper, but in reality, it kept creeping upward through all the usual side doors. Groceries, utilities, little repairs, shared expenses that somehow became my expenses when the timing worked against them and my paycheck happened to land first. My mom always framed it softly. Could you help us with this one? Just until next week. It would really stabilize things. My dad almost never asked directly. He preferred the atmosphere that formed around the need. That was his style. He let my mother make the request. Then he enforced the moral meaning of my answer. If I said yes, everything stayed calm. If I hesitated, suddenly we were not discussing money anymore. We were discussing attitude, gratitude, maturity, and whether I understood how households worked. One night the internet went out because the bill had not been paid on time. It was not a huge crisis, just a nuisance. My mom called the provider, came back into the kitchen looking embarrassed, and said they needed the balance cleared. I looked at her for a second. We talked about this, I said. I thought I was already covering that. You usually are, she said too quickly. It just got mixed in with some other things. That sentence made no sense, but I already knew there would be no clean answer behind it. Before I could say anything else, my dad spoke from the doorway. If you're using it, you can help fix it. I turned and looked at him. I already am helping fix it. He shrugged. Then fix it faster. I paid it anyway, and I hated myself a little for doing it. It was not because I could not afford it. It was because I could feel the habit hardening around me. I was not stepping in to help anymore. I was absorbing disorder before it could inconvenience anyone else. That is a dangerous role in a family house, because once you become the person who prevents friction, people stop noticing how much of their peace is being subsidized. They only notice when you stop. Around that time, I started staying out later more often. Not because I had some dramatic nightlife to return to. Mostly because I realized I was timing my own evenings around the emotional weather in that house, and I hated what that meant. If my dad was in a certain mood, I stayed out. If he had been making comments all week, I found reasons not to be home. That is one of the ugliest things about slow control. It trains you to orbit it long before you openly admit it is there. One Friday, I came home just after 10. He was in the living room again, sitting in the dark with the TV on low, like he wanted the whole room to feel like a warning. You're barely here lately, he said. I set my keys on the side table. I'm here plenty. He looked at the clock. Not when it matters. I almost asked what that meant, but I already knew. It meant I was becoming less available to the house. Less available to the atmosphere. Less available to the constant low-level management of need. I work all week, I said. I'm allowed to go out. His face changed slightly at that. Not shocked. Just colder. Allowed. He repeated, like the word itself carried some hidden insult. He repeated the word like it carried some hidden insult. That's interesting, he said. I was too tired for whatever version of this conversation he wanted. I'm going to bed, I said. He spoke before I could move. As long as you're staying here because you can't afford not to, you should be a little more careful about how you talk. That was the first time he said it that directly. It still was not the full sentence, but the outline of it was visible by then. He was no longer just referencing the market. He was linking it to obedience. I turned back toward him. What does that mean? He did not answer right away. He let the room sit in it for a second, like he enjoyed making people lean forward emotionally before he gave them the next line. It means, he said, that pride gets expensive. I stared at him. Then I said, so does staying. His jaw tightened. Not enough for a fight. Enough to mark the line. I went to bed with my whole body carrying that conversation like static. The next morning, my mom knocked on my door around 9. She came in holding a mug of coffee like that made the visit gentler. He didn't mean it the way it sounded, she said. I sat up and took the mug just to give my hand something to do. What way did he mean it then? She sighed. You know how he gets. That phrase again. It had probably carried more bad behavior in my family than any single lie. He's stressed, she continued. Everything feels unstable right now. That irritated me too, because it was not entirely false. The house did feel tighter than it used to. My dad's hours at work had been reduced. My mom had picked up more shifts where she could. The pressure was real. But real pressure does not turn someone into a different person. It just gives them a better excuse to reveal the version of themselves they already prefer. What exactly is unstable? I asked. She sat down on the edge of the chair by my desk and looked at the floor for a second before answering. Everything. The bills. The house. The timing of everything. We're just trying to stay ahead. There was a version of me, not even that old a version, that would have heard that and immediately stepped back into fixer mode. Instead, I asked the question I should have asked much earlier. How far behind are things? She hesitated. That was all the answer I needed at first. Then she said, not enough to panic. Which is not a number. It matters to me, I said. I know, she said. Then tell me. I said. She told me enough. Not every detail. Not all at once. But enough to make the shape visible. They were carrying more than I had realized, and less than my dad pretended. The house was not on the edge of immediate collapse, but it was fragile enough that any disruption hit harder than they wanted to admit. My money had not become useful by coincidence. It had become part of the balance. That changed something for me too. Because once I understood that my presence was not just convenient but structurally helpful, his behavior stopped reading as random hostility and started reading as strategy. Maybe not conscious strategy in every moment, but strategy all the same. If I stayed, contributed, and believed I had fewer real options outside the house, then he got stability and authority at the same time. That is a powerful combination for a man like him. After that conversation with my mom, I started looking at my numbers more seriously. Not in the vague, I should move out soon, way I had been doing before. I opened spreadsheets. I compared actual rent ranges. I cut optional spending harder. I looked at what I could survive, not what would feel comfortable. That shift did not make me freer immediately. It made me quieter, and my father noticed. The next few weeks were some of the strangest in the whole arrangement because nothing exploded, but everything got tighter. He asked more questions. Where was I going? When was I coming back? What was I spending? Whether it really made sense to waste money on certain things right now. He never said the full sentence in daylight. Not yet. But it was in everything. The house market is bad. Moving is expensive. You are still here. Therefore, act accordingly. I started realizing that what he wanted from the situation was not just help. He wanted psychological leverage. He wanted to be the person who knew I had fewer choices than I liked. Once you see that in somebody, it becomes impossible to unsee. The real turning point came on a Wednesday. Nothing dramatic had happened that day. I came home from work, picked up a few groceries on the way, and walked into one of those heavy silences that tell you a conversation has already happened before you got there. My mom was in the kitchen. My dad was at the table, looking through a stack of mail. I put the grocery bag down and started unpacking it. No one said anything for a few seconds. Then my dad lifted one envelope slightly and asked, without looking at me, "You still serious about moving out?" I should have lied. I should have said I was just thinking. Instead, I said, yes. He set the envelope down. With what money, he asked. The line landed exactly the way he wanted it to. Not hidden in a joke. Not tucked into concern. Just out in the open. I looked at him. The money I earn. He actually laughed at that. Not loud. Just one short, ugly sound. That's optimistic, he said. My mom said his name again. He ignored her. I kept my voice even. I'm not discussing my finances with you. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. No, you just want to keep pretending you're one good month away from independence. That sentence sat in the room like smoke. I could feel my own anger trying to rise too fast, and I knew if I let it, I would say something messy instead of useful. So I said nothing. He took that as permission to keep going. You know what your problem is? He asked. You still think this is temporary because admitting otherwise would make you feel like you failed. My hand stopped moving. That was close enough to a real hit that even my mother looked up sharply. Maybe some part of him knew he had gone too far, because he softened his tone right after. He did not get kinder. He just sounded more clinical. I'm saying face reality. Everything is expensive. You're here because you need to be here. Start acting like it. That was when the shape of the future became clear to me. If I stayed, it would only get worse. He was not going to throw me out, and in some ways that would have been simpler. It would get worse because the longer the market stayed brutal, the more entitled he would feel to the control it gave him. And I had just heard the cleanest version of the sentence he had been building toward the whole time. You need to be here. Which meant, in his mind, I needed to adapt to him. I finished putting the groceries away, went to my room, and sat there for a long time looking at my laptop without seeing anything on the screen. Then I opened a rental site again, not hopefully and not casually, like a man finally accepting that the bad option was still better than the trap. After that night, I stopped treating moving out like a vague future plan and started treating it like an extraction. That is a different mindset. When something is a plan, you leave space around it. You compare options, wait for the right timing. Tell yourself you are being smart by not rushing. When something becomes an extraction, you stop asking what feels ideal. You start asking what gets you out. I did not tell my parents that. I did not tell anyone, actually. Not at first. I just got quieter. I spent more time with spreadsheets, rental sites, and my banking app. I cut back on anything that was not necessary. I started moving small things mentally into two categories: what I needed to survive on my own, and what had been keeping that house comfortable while I was still inside it. That second category turned out to be bigger than I liked. It was not just the agreed monthly contribution anymore. It was groceries, utilities, random one-time costs, and the soft emergencies that somehow always seemed to land near my paycheck. None of it looked dramatic on its own. That was the genius of the whole arrangement. Every individual piece felt explainable. It only looked ugly when you stepped back far enough to see the whole machine. And once I started stepping back, my father started stepping in harder. He did not suddenly become louder. He became more deliberate. He began asking more questions about where I was going and what time I would be back, but now there was less pretending around it. It did not sound parental anymore. It sounded territorial. If I came home with shopping bags, he wanted to know what I had bought. If I was on my laptop in the living room, he asked what I was working on. If I got a phone call and took it outside, he asked who it was. None of that would have sounded insane to an outsider. That was the trap. It was always just normal enough to survive a retelling if you left out tone, timing, and accumulation. But when you live inside it, you feel what it is. You feel the net getting checked for holes. One Saturday morning, I was in the driveway cleaning out my car when he came outside carrying a trash bag. He looked in through the passenger window and saw a folded apartment brochure I had picked up from a leasing office earlier that week. He did not mention it right away. He tossed the trash bag into the bin, stood there for a second, then said, "You're still chasing that?" I kept wiping down the dashboard. "I'm still looking." He laughed under his breath. "At what?" I turned and looked at him. "At places to live." He nodded slowly, like I had confirmed something childish. "You should stop wasting your time on fantasy." He came back to that word a lot. He loved framing independence as delusion. It made his version of reality feel more mature by comparison. "I'm not wasting my time," I said. He crossed his arms. "Then you're wasting your money." That annoyed me more than it should have, mostly because I was already hearing him in my head too often. That is what prolonged pressure does. It starts renting space in your thinking even before you agree with it. I shut the car door. "I don't need you to evaluate my budget." "No," he said. "You just need a place to keep hiding from it." It was one of his favorite tactics. If I pushed back on the control, he reframed it as denial. Suddenly, he was not intrusive. He was realistic. I was not independent. I was defensive. I went back inside without answering. He followed a minute later, not physically close, just close enough to keep the conversation alive. In the kitchen, my mom was sorting coupons and half listening in the way people do when they absolutely are listening but want the option to deny involvement later. My dad opened the fridge, took out a bottle of water, and said to no one in particular, "A lot of people are going to ruin themselves trying to prove they don't need help." The comment was aimed at me, and everyone in the kitchen knew it. Everything was for me now. My mom gave him that same tired warning look. He ignored it. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, then took my coffee and went to my room. I did not do that because I was scared of him. I did it because I was starting to understand that every conversation with him had become a test of whether I would stay emotionally available to the house. He did not just want me living there. He wanted me participating in the logic of staying there. That difference mattered. At work, things were normal enough to feel unreal by comparison. People complained about deliveries, staffing, overtime, scheduling gaps, all the usual nonsense. Nobody asked where I was going at night. Nobody treated my paycheck like a resource the building had rights over. Nobody tried to turn market conditions into a reason I should be easier to control. That contrast got sharper every week. I found myself staying later sometimes just because being at work felt cleaner than being in that house. Not happier, just cleaner. One afternoon, a coworker of mine named Chris mentioned that his cousin was looking for a roommate. He said it casually while we were waiting for a printer to stop pretending it had never seen paper before in its life. I asked a couple questions just to sound interested, but something in me had already gone alert. Not because I desperately wanted a roommate situation. I did not. But because for the first time in weeks, an option had appeared that did not start with me having to explain myself to my father. The place was not amazing, and Chris made that clear. It was in an older building, the room was small, and the commute would be about 35 minutes longer each day. But the rent was realistic at $780 plus split utilities, and it was available soon. Soon mattered. I took the number. I did not call immediately. I waited until I was in my car after work, then called from the parking lot. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. It was enough to tell me the place was real, the roommates sounded normal, and the numbers were survivable. They were not comfortable, but they were survivable. That word felt more honest than affordable. That night, I did not tell my parents anything. I went home, ate, kept my head down, and watched my father move through the kitchen with that same low-key sense of ownership he always had. One hand on the counter, mail stacked near his elbow. Small comments about groceries and electricity and the thermostat like he was managing an operation instead of a family. For the first time, I looked at him and thought, "You only sound this confident because you think I have nowhere to go." That thought changed the emotional temperature of the room for me immediately. I was still there, still under the same roof, still listening to the same voice. But now there was a crack in the certainty he had been building around me. The next few days were strange because I had information he did not. I toured the place after work on Tuesday. It was exactly as average as promised. The walls were beige, the hallway was narrow, the bathroom needed better lighting, and the kitchen looked like it had been updated by someone who stopped caring halfway through. I would not have chosen it under better circumstances. That was why it mattered. It was a real option, not a fantasy one. By the time I got back to my parents' house that night, I felt something I had not felt in months. What I felt in that moment was not freedom. It was direction, which was better than what I had been living on. And somehow, my father picked up on it almost immediately. He was sitting at the table when I got in. Not doing much. Just there, with the TV low and a few envelopes spread out near one elbow. "You're late," he said. "I told Mom I had something after work." "What's something?" I put my keys down slowly. "I'm not 15. He nodded. "That's not an answer." There was a version of me from a year earlier that probably would have snapped right there. But I had started understanding something useful about him. Anger fed him. It made him feel like the center of the room. Calm starved him. So I stayed calm. "I had something to do," I said. He looked at me for a second. Then he asked, "Apartment?" That caught me more than I wanted it to. Not because it was some masterstroke, but because it told me he had been watching every shift in my behavior with far more attention than I had wanted to believe. I did not answer fast enough, and that answered him anyway. He leaned back. "You're serious?" he said. "Yes," I said. He smiled again, that same dry, almost pleased expression that always meant he thought the next part was going to expose me. "Did you bring a calculator?" My mom was in the next room. I could hear dishes moving. Slow. Careful. The house had that feeling again, the one where everyone knows something is happening, but no one wants to be the first to call it what it is. "I know what things cost," I said. "Do you?" he asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, you've had a front row seat to what it costs just to keep one house running." That line was not random either. He was trying to close the loop, to turn the very financial burden I had been helping carry into evidence that I should stay trapped inside it. "I'm aware," I said. "No," he replied. "You're aware in theory. There's a difference." Then he tapped the stack of envelopes on the table. Life gets expensive very fast when nobody is cushioning the fall for you. That was the threat hidden inside the offer. The offer hidden inside the threat. Stay here. Stay dependent. Stay under control. Call it realism, and nobody has to say the ugly part out loud. I looked at him for a second, then asked the question I had started asking more often because it forced him out of performance mode. "Do you want me here because it helps me, or because it helps this house?" That actually made him pause. Not long, but long enough. Then he said, "Those aren't separate things." That answer told me more than he probably meant it to. He no longer even believed the distinction mattered. That was the logic of the whole house by then. My help and their need had been fused into one moral category, and because the category was family, any boundary I tried to draw automatically looked selfish. My mom walked in then, drying her hands on a towel, and asked if anyone wanted tea. That was her move whenever tension got too explicit. She would offer a drink, move a plate, wipe a counter, or bring in some domestic gesture large enough to suggest the conversation should return to normal. "I'm good," I said. My dad did not answer her. He was still looking at me. Then he said, quietly enough that it almost sounded reasonable, "You need to stop romanticizing struggle." That phrase irritated me in a new way, because he was not warning me about hardship. He was warning me about leaving the arrangement that benefited him. "I'm not romanticizing anything," I said. "I'm trying to leave." And for the first time in weeks, the room changed immediately. No slow burn. No subtlety. My mother stopped moving. My father's face hardened in a way that made him look older. "Trying," he repeated. "Yes," I said. "With what plan?" he asked. "A real one," I said. He let out a dry breath through his nose. "Then let me save you some embarrassment. You can't afford to walk out of here just because your feelings got hurt." That was the closest he had come so far. Not the full sentence. Not yet. But the skeleton of it was right there on the table. "You can't afford to walk out." I could feel my pulse in my neck at that point, which annoyed me, because it meant he was still getting under my skin exactly the way he wanted. "This is not about my feelings," I said. "Then what is it about?" I looked right at him. "It's about the fact that you talk to me like I'm lucky to be here while I'm helping keep this place running." My mother said my name softly, like that would smooth the edges off what I had just said. It did not. My father did not raise his voice. That would have made it too easy. Instead, he sat there in that rigid, still way he had when he was trying to make silence itself feel like authority. Then he said, "If you think tossing money into groceries and bills makes you equal to the people who built this house, you've lost your mind." That line stayed with me because of how cleanly it revealed him. Not the practical him. Not the stressed him. The real him. My money counted as support when he wanted it. It did not count as stake. It did not count as voice. It did not count as adulthood. It only counted as evidence that I should be easier to manage because the house was still receiving it. That was the emotional contract he had in his head. I went to bed that night with the whole conversation replaying in me like static. The next morning, I put down a holding deposit on the room. I did it sitting in my car before work, while the engine was still off and my hands were cold from the steering wheel. When the confirmation email came through, I stared at it for a second and felt that same strange combination of fear and relief that shows up whenever you finally do the thing you have been mentally rehearsing for too long. It was not a glamorous decision. It was not a victory lap. It was a line in the ground. And the moment I made it, everything inside that house became temporary again. That should have made the last few days easier. It did the opposite. Because once you know you are leaving, every controlling gesture becomes sharper. Every comment lands differently. Every room starts to feel less like a home and more like a place you are about to walk out of while the people inside it still think they own the ending. I started quietly sorting my things. Nothing obvious. Nothing dramatic. Just small movements. A bag in the closet. Some papers moved into my car. Stuff I did not want trapped there if the atmosphere got worse before I was ready. My father noticed that too. He noticed everything by then. On Friday night, I came home and found him in the kitchen, standing by the counter while my mother went through receipts. He looked at me, then at the keys in my hand, then at the tote bag I had brought in from the car. "Still planning your escape?" he asked. I should have said nothing. Instead, I said, "Yes." He smiled without warmth. And that was the expression he wore when the full sentence finally arrived. He smiled without warmth and said, "You really think you can just walk out and make this work?" My mother looked up from the receipts, but did not say anything. She had that same expression she always got when a conversation was crossing the invisible line between tense and honest. It was the face of someone who already knew what was true but still hoped tone could keep reality from becoming official. I set my bag down on the counter. "Yes," I said. He gave a slow nod, like he was humoring a child who had just announced he was going to build a boat out of cardboard and cross the ocean with it. "With what money?" he asked. "After everything you've been paying here?" That part almost made me laugh, because he had finally said the quiet part out loud. The same money that supposedly did not give me any say in the house had suddenly become proof that I could not survive outside it. "That's my problem," I said. "No," he replied. "It becomes my problem when you make reckless decisions and then come crawling back because reality hit harder than your pride." He was back on the same idea again. He kept trying to frame my leaving as ego, because if he could call it pride, then he got to stay the reasonable one. "It's not pride," I said. I just don't want to live like this anymore. My mother finally stepped in. Can we not do this tonight? My father did not even look at her. No, he said. Actually, this is exactly when we do it. He turned back to me. You've had a roof over your head, lower expenses, and more support than most people get, and somehow you've managed to turn that into resentment. That irritated me more than anything else he had said that week, because it was the cleanest version of his entire worldview. In his mind, help erased the right to complain. Once someone gave you shelter, they also got the right to shape the emotional rules of the place. I'm not resentful because I stayed here, I said. I'm resentful because every time I tried to act like an adult, you treated it like disobedience. He actually scoffed at that. Act like an adult, he said. Adults handle reality. They don't run from it. Adults don't use bills as leverage, I said. That hit hard enough that my mother closed her eyes for a second. He leaned one hand on the counter and lowered his voice, which somehow made it worse. You want the truth? He asked. The truth is that you're still here because the world out there is expensive, and this house has protected you from that. The least you could do is stop acting like being here makes you some kind of victim. There are moments in arguments where you can feel the whole structure of the relationship snap into focus. Not because something new is revealed, but because something old is finally spoken clearly enough that nobody can pretend otherwise afterward. It was one of those moments. Because what he was saying was simple. He believed that because the outside world was expensive, the inside of his house came with terms. And those terms were not just financial. They were behavioral, emotional, hierarchical. I looked at him and said, that protection always came with a price. He stared at me for a second, then said the sentence he had been circling for months. You can't afford to leave, so you'll listen to me. My mother said his name immediately, sharp and low, like she was trying to stop the sound from settling fully into the room. But it already had. And the strange thing was that once he said it, I felt calmer. It was not because it hurt less than I expected. It was because it clarified everything. There was no more pretending that this was concern, or realism, or family friction made worse by housing costs. The sentence was exactly what the whole year had been trying to become. I nodded once. Thank you, I said. That caught both of them off guard. My father frowned. For what? He asked. For finally saying it clearly. He straightened. You think that changes anything? Yes, I said. It does. Then I picked up my bag, walked past them, and went to my room. I did not slam the door. I did not shout. I did not pack like someone escaping a fire. I packed like someone who had already left emotionally and was now just making the paperwork match. That night, I took what I needed. Clothes, laptop, documents, chargers, toiletries, a few personal things I did not want left behind long enough to become symbolic hostages. I loaded them into my car in 2 quiet trips while the house stayed mostly silent behind me. Neither of my parents came out while I was doing it. I think my mother wanted to. I think my father refused to let the situation become openly dramatic because drama can backfire when it makes your own behavior too visible. Before I left, I went back inside one last time to check the room. He was standing in the hallway when I came out. He was not blocking the door, and he was not helping either. He was just standing there like he wanted to make sure the final image still belonged to him. You're serious, he said. Yes, I said. He folded his arms. You'll be back, he said. There was no anger in his voice when he said that. That was what made it ugly. He was not trying to hurt me in the moment. He was trying to define the future in a way that would let him stay right even after I left. I looked at him and said, that's the part you still don't understand. He waited. I'd rather struggle somewhere else than be comfortable here. That was the only thing I said to him that night that seemed to actually land. Not because it convinced him, but because it insulted the entire logic of the house. I left. There was no final hug with my mother, no ceremony, and no dramatic speech in the driveway. Just the sound of my car door shutting and the street opening up in front of me like something I should have chosen months earlier. The first few days in the new place were not glamorous, and I knew that before I even unpacked. The room was small. The bed was worse than advertised. The bathroom light made everyone look tired and slightly green. The kitchen cabinets did not shut properly unless you lifted them first. My commute got longer, and my budget got tighter immediately. But the air felt different. No one asked where I was going. No one used the cost of existing as a reason I should be easier to control. No one acted like shelter turned adulthood into debt. That mattered more than I had expected. The practical fallout started quickly. The first call came from my mother 4 days later. She did not start with an apology. She started with soft concern, which was her way of approaching almost every mess in life. "How is it there?" she asked. "It's fine." That word again. Only this time it actually meant what I wanted it to mean. She hesitated. Then she asked, "Did you change your transfers?" There it was. Straight to the bloodstream of the house. "Yes," I said. Another pause. "Everything?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She exhaled quietly into the phone. "I just wish you hadn't done it so suddenly." That sentence annoyed me because of how neatly it skipped over cause and jumped straight to inconvenience. "It wasn't sudden," I said. "You both had plenty of warning. He just didn't think I'd actually leave." She did not defend him immediately, which told me more than a defense would have. "It's been tight this week," she said. I looked around the room. Beige walls. Cheap desk. One window facing a parking lot. Nothing in it was impressive, but every inch of it was paid for without somebody attaching authority to the bill. "I'm sorry things are tight," I said. "But I'm not paying for that house anymore." She went quiet after that. Not offended. Just tired. And that was the first time I felt something close to pity for her that did not immediately turn back into obligation. She had spent years making his version of reality easier to live inside, and now she was stuck with the cost of it. A week after that, my father called. I almost did not answer, but I wanted to hear what he sounded like now that I was gone, and the market had not magically forced me to crawl back into his kitchen. His tone was measured. Too measured. "You settled in?" he asked. That almost made me laugh. He had never cared about whether I was settled in my life, only whether I was staying within whatever orbit made sense to him. "Yes," I said. "How's the budget?" he asked. There it was. Straight to the wound he hoped still existed. "Tight," I said. He was quiet for half a second, probably because he thought that proved something. Then I added, "But worth it." That took some of the air out of him. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said. "No," I replied. "You made it impossible to stay." "That's dramatic," he said. "No," I said. "It's accurate." He did not like that. He tried a few more angles after that. Family. Responsibility. The idea that I was overreacting to one bad sentence spoken in stress. But by then the sentence was not the point anymore. The sentence had just been the cleanest version of the logic he had been living by all along. Eventually he got quiet and asked, "So that's it?" And that question told me everything. Because even now, he still thought this was about the argument. About timing. About emotion. He still did not understand that the real break had happened long before the line in the kitchen. The line had just made it impossible to pretend there was still anything worth negotiating. "For now, yes," I said. He did not say goodbye. He just ended the call. After that, things settled into the kind of distance that feels strange at first and then starts to feel clean. My mother still reached out sometimes with small messages, holiday check-ins, and updates about relatives. She never fully admitted what had happened, but she stopped pretending it was random. That was enough for the moment. My father and I barely spoke. And honestly, that was fine. Because the thing I kept realizing over the next few months was that I had not just moved out of a house. I had moved out of a role. For more than a year, I had been the person who helped absorb financial pressure, emotional tension, and practical disorder, all while being reminded that none of it changed my standing inside the house. I was useful, but not equal. Necessary, but never acknowledged in a way that threatened his authority. The housing market had made that role easier for him to justify. That was the real-world backdrop. The numbers, the headlines, and the constant stories about how hard it had become to afford independence. But the deeper problem had never been the market. The market just gave him a sharper weapon. What trapped me was staying long enough for someone else to mistake my vulnerability for obedience. And once I understood that, leaving stopped feeling reckless. It started feeling overdue. He thought I was trapped by housing costs. What actually trapped me was believing I had to keep paying for access to my own adulthood.